As I've mentioned a couple of times in previous videos, Kingdom Come Deliverance is a simulation first, RPG second, and one of the gameplay features where this is clearly apparent comes from using a bow. Unlike in other games where this mechanic is much more accessible, that is not the case with this one. So it's quite understandable that there are players having a tough time with it, and it's the goal of this tutorial to help them out. Before we begin, it bears mentioning that learning archery in this game demands practice, just like in real life. Although the game's version of it is much more simplified, that fundamental requirement stays the same. As far as I know, there are mainly two ways on how to use a classical bow. First is what's commonly known as instinctive shooting, aka reflexive shooting, where the accuracy is primarily based on muscle memory from repeated training more than the visual input. A prime example of an instinctive shooter is Lars Anderson. If you check out any of his demonstration videos, you'll see that his accuracy is out of this world, while not spending much time aiming his weapon. The only problem is, I'm not sure how one would go about teaching people this method because it just boils down to practice, and that's not very instructive. So instead, we turn to the other method called gap shooting, where we adjust our aim using a reference in relation to the target's position. Most players would generate a crosshair using a console command, or utilize the similar built-in feature most monitors nowadays have. But in this case, we'll be using the tip of the arrowhead as a guide, so that everyone can follow along regardless of what platform they play on. Just a quick heads up that how well of an archer Henry is overall depends on multiple factors. Strength, agility, vitality, bow skill level, and the quality of the weapon itself affect things like how fast can he do a full draw, the extent of the horizontal sway, and even the rate of stamina drain are determined by these aspects. Obviously, I can't account for all the possible variations, so I'll just be using the simple low-level villager's ash bow for most of the demonstrations to have everyone covered. It's also a good reminder that until Henry reaches bow skill level 5, he'll have to wear vambraces to avoid getting hurt by the string, which is fine, it's a nice looking gear. For this tutorial, we'll be hanging around at the archery range in Ujits. You can choose another similar location scattered across the map if you wish. I just prefer this one because it's a nice open field that's well lit during daytime and makes it a lot easier to see what we're doing. The first thing we need to establish is the arrow's consistency with regards to its range. We can do that by releasing them only when the bow is at full draw, using the arrowhead as a marker. When it stops moving as the entire shaft slides back, then we know we're at that point. This is great because, as mentioned before, the tip of the arrow is our guide and is crucial for the next step as we establish our reference. Here we have one of the targets at very close range, 5 paces away. If we shoot the center area with the tip of the arrow pointing at it, you'll notice that they tend to land on the upper left portion. To compensate for this, we'll need to relocate our guide, and an easy way to visualize that is by focusing on the target and where the arrow landed. We then draw an imaginary line that connects those 2 points, and use that on our guide to determine where it should be next in order to hit the center area. This is our reference at close range, and the farther the target is, the more we have to adjust this upwards and to the right. It also depends on the target's height. If they're at an elevated position, like this bird's nest, we'll have to nudge this upwards, and vice versa if we're the one high up. Apart from those two, the quality of the bow we're using also has a significant effect, because the better its stats, the farther its maximum range, which means less vertical compensation is required. But when it comes to its horizontal counterpart, there is very little difference regardless of what we have equipped. I tested this out at 15 paces and farther, using Villager's ash bow and Capon's hunting bow. Based on my observation, the horizontal reference point for both weapons are the same, and the amount of adjustment we'll have to do in comparison to the vertical is not that much. I'd say a ratio of around 1 to 3. The key takeaway here is that if you want a better chance of hitting a target, aim the tip of your arrowhead on its right side and use your judgment based from your training with that weapon to determine where the reference should approximately be. The archery range is great for honing this, and all we have to do is buy dozens of arrows and practice hitting the target at different distances, from 5 paces away, then 15, which is a standard for the archery contest in Ujits, and maybe even farther away if you wish. Just try not to scare the nearby villager.
Quick, everyone, come here!
Okay, with those aiming concepts out of the way, it's time to talk about shooting form. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that the arrow should only be released when the bow is at full draw. But even before we start to do that, it's important for us to place the target somewhere at the vertical center of the screen, depending on its distance, then nudge it a little bit to the left. This is done so that Henry's movements as he takes aim is confined to the right side of the target. Since he swings his bow left and right while bobbing up and down, it's not a good idea to continuously adjust our aim at the same time because it will clash with his. So my advice is to only make quick manual adjustments to get the reference within range and let him do the rest, so we can just focus on releasing the trigger when our guide lines up with it. Let's put that into practice by participating at the archery contest. As you can see here, we have the target lined up at the center of the screen and a bit to the left. Since it's 15 paces away and I'm using a weak bow, I also placed it on the lower portion of the screen. As for my initial reference, I used the area above this nettle. The first arrow lands and I shot too high, so I nudged my aim lower and let the arrows loose when the guide is just above the same marker. Because Henry is doing most of the aiming and I'm just focusing on the trigger, it's quite possible to land our shots within a very narrow area. This is as good as it can get, but in practical applications, pinpoint precision like this is not really necessary. As long as our estimations and adjustments are within the ballpark, we should still be able to hit the target, and is actually the more realistic outcome because most of the creatures we'll be shooting at are not stationary. And this is where the game of chumps comes into play.
Henry is the victor.
Once you become very familiar with your bow and arrows at the archery range, it's now time for you to play that game at Ledechko. What we'll be practicing here is the ability to make quick adjustments on our aim, as the logs constantly change their distance in relation to our position. Let's visualize that through a diagram. This blue area represents the river. The green circle is Henry. And these brown rectangles are the logs. The target is closest to Henry when we're looking straight at it from across the direction of the river, which gradually gets farther away as it passes by. And the exact opposite happens when we try to shoot the log as it approaches our center line. That's one thing to keep in mind. The other is with regards to elevation, as some parts of the riverside are a bit high up. With enough experience on both courses, there will come a time when we're no longer consciously thinking about our reference, to a point where we would aim our guide automatically and release the arrow when it feels right, which is the very definition of instinctive shooting. Yes, in my opinion, being good at gap shooting eventually leads to that, so Take time to practice because it does pay off. And remember, it's okay to miss some of our shots. The important thing is to stay focused as we make adjustments for the next one. Now then, let's take a look at a practical example.
Over here! Where is everyone? Quick! Raise the alarm! Watch out! Over here! Where is everyone? Quick! Christ!